Hello, I'm Cole Pauls. I'm a comic artist, printmaker, and illustrator from Haines Junction, Yukon. I've lived in Vancouver for the last 7 years, and I'm the author of Dakwäkãda Warriors and Pizza Punks. I'm here today to instruct you on a Hertiage comic for Vancouver. This was originally supposed to be in-person class, and we were supposed to make a comic together, and it would be about your heritage, but instead I'm at home in my home studio, and I'm going to teach you how I make my own heritage comics. So before we start, I'm just going to share with you my worksheet for heritage comics. So what is your heritage? It's your family and culture. It's your ethnicity and nation. It's your traditions, traditional food. For ideas, to brainstorm over what you could make for your own heritage comic is your family history. It could be your traditional name. If you don't have, if you're from a non-English speaking family. My traditional name is Tanashute, which is Teltan for lead wolf. What nation you're from? Like I said before, I'm Teltan, but I'm also from the Yukon, and I grew up in Champagnat territory, and I am a member of the Champagnat First Nations. Something your family practices together. That could be, biking, could be archery, it could be practicing traditional song and dance, whatever your family likes to do together as a family. Something important to your family, like traditions. An old building or spot that is culturally important. The example at the bottom of this worksheet on the left is a 4-step process to my comic drawing. And the comic I drew for that example is about my family's fish camp, 9 Mile, which is in Telegraph Creek, which I will also draw a comic about in this workshop. And what clan you're from. So I'm from the Wolf clan. And, it could be art, singing, or drumming. So those are, examples of heritage and what you could choose for your own heritage comic. But quickly, I'll just go over my step-by-step process. So what I like to do is write out the story first. And what I mean by writing out the story first is thumbnailing your comic. And then also, pre-planning it. And what I mean by pre-planning is writing all your dialogue first and your panel layouts. So once I have my text and panel layouts written down, that's when I come in and I illustrate the characters and then backgrounds last. And then I do the same process inking things. I like to ink the text and panels first, and then I'll do the characters and backgrounds last. So without any further ado, let's begin. Okay, so we're gonna begin with step 1, and that's our thumbnail. And our thumbnail is so we can plan out our comic. And it's really important to plan out your comic because when you work on the finished art, you can just tackle it and you can just execute it, and it'll be hopefully as pain-free as possible. It's all the pre-planning. It's like a tattoo. If you have a bad tattoo sketch and you tattoo it, you're gonna have a bad tattoo. So it's good to pre-plan and solve any problems ahead of schedule before you work on your final artwork. Normally I like to thumbnail in my sketchbook, and I like to thumbnail with a ballpoint pen. And the reason why I like this is because it feels really loose, and doesn't really feel like I'm committing to anything psychologically. Just personally, if I work with a brush pen or something, it feels very permanent. But when I work with a ballpoint pen, it's like, I'm doodling, I'm sketching, and it doesn't feel as intimidating as working with just a straight up fancy pen right away. So yeah, I'm just gonna begin. Normally, the first panel is the header, and what I mean by the header is that it's the cover or pseudo cover for your comic, because this is just this is just one story, right? A one-page comic. And if you're in an anthology, or if you're, made a book with a friend, and you don't have a space for a cover for your comic, it's a way to show that it's a new beginning to a new story. And it's important to have your name too, because then people can realize it's a new author too. So this Hertiage comic, I decided to make it about obsidian, which is it's a volcanic glass that indigenous people use to make arrowheads and different types of tools, and the Tahltan people, like my ancestors, all used them. So I'm just going to go ahead and write my title. So Dudot is Tahltan for obsidian, and I learned that because a friend of mine who I often collaborate with, their name is Sema, and Thema, she told me. I asked her if she knew the word, and she did. Yeah, I'm just gonna work. I have a reference photo in front of me. You can't see it on the screen. I'll just show you really quickly. But this is a photo of Mount Edzaidza, which is an old volcano in Telegraph, or just outside of Telegraph in Tahltan territory. And this is where we got all our obsidian from. And my ancestors and everyone else who's part of the Tahltan nation, they all their families all used the obsidian from this mountain, and it's very sacred land. And yeah, it's a piece of Tahltan history that is very important, because most of our trade as a Tahltan nation was used with obsidian, so it's considered very sacred. So there's my first panel, I've decided. And then I'm gonna just go ahead and think about what I'm gonna do for these next 3 panels. Sorry, I'm gonna get a little quiet just because I need to think about what I'm gonna write about, because this is just me showing you my thought process for the thumbnail, for the comic, my pre-planning, right? So When we are at my family's fish camp, we look for obsidian. My ancestors used it to create tools, and you can still find pieces of them around camp. Okay, so I've written my dialogue for my comic, just to go over it. Dot or Teltan for Obsidian by Kopals. Here's the illustration of Mounted Zaidza. When we are at my family's fish camp, we look for obsidian. My ancestors used to create tools, and you can still... My ancestors used it to create tools, and you can still find pieces of them around camp. You can find them on the fishnet trail, near creeks, on top of cliffs, even the smokehouse, wherever my ancestors roamed. So I still have to draw these 3 panels, and I'm going to use some reference photos for those as well. So I'll show you. I'll quickly draw it. This photo is a picture of my grandma bending over, and she's looking at a piece of obsidian, a very large one that we put on the surface of the ground as, a joke. But this is what you look like when you're searching for obsidian. You're kind of just bent over, and you're looking at the ground, looking for anything shiny. If it's a sunny day, it's actually really useful to use the sun's reflection to find them. So yeah, this is the photo, and then that'll be a panel. And then I'm gonna use another photo for this panel. This photo is my brother Andy's hand, and he's got a chunk of obsidian arrowhead in it. And this was him, just searching for it on our family's land. You just kind of have to dig around a bit. Sometimes you flip open a rock and you find it. It's pretty special, it's a connection to my ancestors and my family, because the land that we have our fish camp on has been used for generations and generations. So yeah, it's pretty special to go home, my other home, Telegraph Creek. I live in Vancouver, and I grew up in Haines Junction, so I'm a Teltan, but I was raised in the Yukon and taught Yukon Indigenous ways, and was part of the Dakwäkãda dancers most of my life, and just makes sense to make comics that are Teltan in Teltan, but also Southern Shoshone comics, Yukon comics that are in Southern Shoshone. I feel like I'm kind of a part of multiple worlds, being Indigenous and living in the city, but also being from a small town. And when I get to go to my family's old land, 9 Mile, our family's fish camp, it's feels special. It's like you're returning to a place you've always known. So that's why I think it's important to use it as an example to show you guys. And yeah, this photo that I'm illustrating right here is a collection of obsidian arrowheads and pieces of obsidian that my dad found a couple summers ago. And yeah, so that is my thumbnail process. And now that I have my comic pre-planned, I can begin the actual final artwork. So I'm just gonna put that beside me, because I think it's important to keep it close to you when you draw your comic. So yeah, this is the comic page I'm gonna work on. It's 8.5 by 11, just a plain piece of white paper. I like to work on a little bit of thicker paper, just because then it can handle all my eraser movements and doesn't rip when I'm being rough with the paper. But yeah, so before we begin, I'll just show off the tools I'm going to use to make the final artwork now. So I have my eraser, my pencil sharpener, my pencil, and then my Microns to ink with. And I have a collection of different sizes, because I like to work with thick lines and then use thinner lines to use for the detail. And then I have this Pentel ink brush pen that uses cartridges. It's refillable. It's pretty fun to use, and I like to fill out my blacks with it. And I fill out my panels. So right now I'm just gonna go ahead and begin. And what I'm doing right now is I'm putting about a 1/2 inch border around the piece of paper. And the reason why I'm doing this is it's kind of like the cutoff for my panels and any of my speech bubbles. Because if you write too close to the edge, when you reproduce your comic page, either that being a zine or a book, there's usually an ink or a print bleed, and sometimes it makes your the edge of your artwork cut off. And if you have text near the very end, it could get cut off too, and then you have a bunch of unfinished words in your comic, and then you spent hours on your book and you're really upset over it because every page has missing words, and it's not a fun experience I've had. So yeah, important to have a border. And yeah, I'm just gonna begin by making the my panel layout. And the reason why I have a 3-tier comic panel layout is just because I like the pacing of the story. It's like beginning, middle, end, and it's really easy to digest as a artist, and deciding what to do. And it's also really easy for the reader to kind of just follow your beat and finish it and completely understand what you're trying to portray in your story. So yeah, got my panels figured out. I got my thumbnail right here, so I'm just gonna start penciling. And yeah, like I did with the thumbnail, I really like to pencil the text first and after doing the panel layout. And the reason why I like to do that is because I don't like erasing my artwork after I've done it and I'm really happy with it. And if you don't leave enough space for your text when you're writing after you've drawn something, you might have to erase a part of it. And then, you might be really proud of a corner, but you have to erase a chunk of it, and now the composition's off. So yeah, I like to write the text first, just so I know exactly how much space I have left in each panel. And another thing I like to do with my panels is I like to give things round edges. And I guess the reason why I did that is because I just like the look of it. And I find comics that are just squares and just like loads and loads of squares can kind of just like, I don't know, it kind of bugs me sometimes. It kind of feels like too sharp or something. I don't know, I'm being funny about it. But yeah, I really like to use round edges for my panels. And another thing I really like to do is incorporate ovoids into my panel layout. And it's just a way for me to incorporate my heritage even deeper into the comic, because ovoids and U-forms, U-shapes, they all create form line, indigenous art, specifically West Coast art. And yeah, so it's like another throwback to my culture. Right. Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna keep going, keep penciling away. Gonna go back to looking at my reference photos. for these drawings, because this is the final artwork now, and I really do want to do a good job portraying these things, because I'm not only representing my own heritage and indigeneity, I'm also talking about a lot of other people's backgrounds. There's a lot of other Teltans, and it's important to keep your culture in mind and think about what is respectful to share and what is to keep within your own culture and your own family. Like there's a lot of songs that the Dakwäkãda dancers don't perform unless it's under a special occasion or it's requested, and you kind of do it out of the respect of what that story is about, or who that performance is for, so it's it's really important to think about what you're representing, who you're representing when you're making your own heritage comic, and to also have fun with it too. As much as kind of a serious subject this is, it is important to just enjoy the process of it. Comics are hard, but I really enjoy producing the work. I get a deep satisfaction making comics. So right now, I'm just deciding if I should move this word bubble down here, or if I should keep it up here, because when you're making a one-page comic, or any comic really, any page count you're on, it's important to think about the reader's eye and where it goes from when you're going from panel to panel. So like, do I want someone to read up here, go down again, and jump up, or should I just make them read right here? Or will it look funny if there's too much text at the bottom? So maybe I should just keep it up at the top. All things to consider when you're making a comic. I think I will leave it up here just because I do have a lot of text in the final panel. Just adding corners to my panels again. All right. When you're making, heritage comics, I find it really helpful to use reference photos, and my reason for that is just because, you could be, it's your heritage, so you're writing about factual things, and you want to make sure that your art and your information is completely correct, because you're talking about real things and you want to be taken seriously, so you want it to be as factual as possible, and you want to be educational, because it's important to share your family story and your story, and you want it to be right. There's my grandma, bent over looking for obsidian. This is my brother's arm, or hand, holding a chunk of obsidian arrowhead. I'll do the background really quickly. Some dirt, a lot of grass. All right. So we got our 3 panels, so we just got one more to do. Okay. And you can see, like, I'm writing, I'm just drawing these quick lines for the text, and it's kind of just keep them on a straight line, because sometimes when I don't do that and I just write the text, they end up kind of being slanted, and it bothers me, so I end up editing it on Photoshop when I'm finished inking the piece. And so it's a good way to keep a structure to your text. And you may have also noticed while I'm drawing, I haven't used a ruler, and I don't like using rulers. Some people, swear by them and use them for like every straight line they can, but I like the impurity of drawing, trying to draw a straight line as best as you can, but it not being a straight line. I like that imperfections. I like things being a tiny bit crooked, like I handwrite everything myself, every comic page, so nothing's ever really repeated. You can tell that my page or my text is handwritten, because all the S's are different, and all the C's and A's and stuff. So I like those small imperfections. So that's why I don't use a ruler, but you definitely can. Like, if you see me making these lines and not being I make it look easy, or it looks I don't know, maybe it looks easy to some people, but also might look really bad to other people. But you know, just go with how you feel. Okay, so now that I have the text done for that panel, I'm going to go back to looking at the reference photo that my dad sent me of all the arrowheads he's found over the last couple of years. You know, and for penciling, you know, you may have noticed I don't like to add a ton of detail, and the reason for that is I just really like to put most of the work into the inks, because inking to me is the funnest part, and this is, you know, kind of just like the skeleton of what I, you know, plan to do. Like, this is kind of like the very, very bare bones of my plans. Like, this is just the concept sketched out. This is, you know, the actual planning of it, and the sorting out. This is kind of like I'm solidifying that I'm gonna do this composition, and I'm gonna write things this certain way. I'm gonna move this up a bit. I'm just gonna do some rearranging. Very important to be happy with your layout before you go to inks, because then you'll you know, have a better drawing. Just like I said about tattoos earlier. So I'm just gonna raise this a bit higher now. You know, like, I could have made this comic just out of memory, and it would have been probably pretty good, but I really like to use the reference photos, just because then it, you know, incorporates, you know, other people's memories of these things. Like these reference photos I took, one of them, like the mounted Zaidza photo, I took that from Thema, who also gave me dot, the Tahltan word for obsidian. And they've hiked up Mount Edsides quite a bit, actually, and it's really interesting to hear their stories, and anyone's stories really, about the mountain, just because it is sacred land, and it's quite the hike to get there. Like, it's if you start outside of Telegraph, and then you hike to Telegraph, and then go past Telegraph, I was told the trip ends up being like over 2 weeks. So you can hike there, or you can fly there. And it is a national park, so it is protected, and it's a big deal to go there. Like, you have to schedule it, because you know, if you're not hiking, you're chartering a helicopter there, or a seaplane, or I guess a lake plane, because you're landing on a lake. There's a couple lakes around Mount Edsides, so. Yeah, in my family, it's a very special thing to find obsidian, no matter how big or small a piece is, you know. Like, when you find a little chunk, it means that one of our ancestors was there, and they were, you know, chipping away. Like, if this was obsidian, they're breaking it off to shape the arrowhead or whatever tool they're building. And then you find all these little chunks, you know, that I'm illustrating here at the bottom. And those little chunks are pieces of the, you know, the tools, you know, that were removed to shape the spear or blade or whatever they were making. You know, so it feels like you're really connecting with your ancestors, because it's literally like I'm on land that my family's used for generations and generations and generations. So it's like I am 100% picking up pieces that my older family members, you know, have all left there for us, which is pretty dang special, if you ask me. All right. So I've completely penciled my comic now, and you can see I've made my space for my text. I figured out the panel layout, figured out my composition for each panel. I am definitely ready to start inking. And to do that, I ink the text first, just like how I penciled it first. And another reason why I like to do this is just like get it out of the way, because out of all the steps into making comics, text is, you know, probably not my favorite thing to do. I only say that because it's easy to mess up. Even when I've written things correctly, like I've spelt things correctly, sometimes when I ink stuff, I will still end up writing it wrong. And I guess that's, you know, just on me, but I do find it annoying, so I kind of just like want to get this step out of the way. Plus, then I know exactly how much space I have left, and there's been times where I've written comics and I've you know, left the text to be the last minute thing, and then I don't end up leaving enough space for my text, and then I have to like use whiteout, or I just have to write over it and then edit it on Photoshop, and it just bugs me. It's a personal thing, I guess. But the one of the interesting things I learned recently talking to Wes Harmon, who I did the land acknowledgement conversation with. They told me they always do the text last because then they can decide on any last minute dialogue changes, which I think that's really smart, because there definitely are times where I've written something and I started drawing a bit of it, but then I stop and then I look at it the next day and I'm like, I don't like how I wrote that. It's funny or something, you know? So Wes's way of waiting to the end to ink all your text just to confirm that that's like 100% what you want to write in your story, that's a great idea. And maybe I'll do that one day, but for now I'm just gonna stick to doing it first just because I like to, you know, get it over and done with. Another thing I like to do when I ink my comics is that I do the panel outline with a fine tip pen, and then I fill it in with the brush pen. And I do this just because I find it easier to fill in blacks when I have a line to keep it in. If I don't, and I kind of just freehand it, I find myself putting too much pressure on the brush, and then when I make the line, it's really thick and I'm like unhappy with it. But if I pressure myself with keeping it within these lines, it's a lot easier for me for some reason. I don't know, it's like a psychological thing, I guess. I also just like, I have an incredibly heavy hand. Another thing I find really helpful when inking comics is to move the piece of paper to whatever is most comfortable for you. You know, normally I don't draw with a pen or a camera in my face, so I can really bend over and like look at what I'm inking without moving the piece of paper. But I'm trying not to put my head in front of the camera as much so you don't just see curly hair. But yeah, so just, you know, draw to what feels comfortable for you. Another thing I like to do with inking is I like to erase before I fill in my blacks. And I do that because then I don't have to re-ink anything because it fades from my harsh eraser movements, you know? Like when I erase and I put a lot of pressure, it'll fade some of the ink. So I like to just do it like this, and then when I fill in the black, when I fill in all my line work, it will cover up any fades that are caused by these eraser movements. Just like that. Filling in the black. All right, there you go. There's my first ovoid panel, the header to the story. So I'm just gonna continue this and do that for each panel, text and panel first, before I do the backgrounds and characters. And I'm inking the text with my 08 size Micron, one of the larger sizes for the Micron. And I just like my text being really bold, because when it gets shrunken down, it's still really easy to read. Because, you know, this is 8.5 by 11. In a zine format, it's 5.5 by 8.5. So that's like half that size, half of this page, right? So it's going to be read at half the size I drew it. So it's always good to draw a bit big for keeping that in mind. So another thing you'll notice too is that I'm writing the text first before I draw the square around it. And that's because I'm making sure I'm giving myself enough space for all the text, and I want everything to have enough breathing space in the panel. Because, you know, you can make a really good comic, but the text could just like look funny and throw the whole story off. And that's another reason why I personally don't put in my text digitally, just because I find I've read comics where the text really does not flow with the artwork at all, and you're like, you keep thinking about that when you're reading, and you know, you kind of like feel disconnected from the story because like that bothers you. But I'm also a creator, so like things like that really bother me, because you know, I make comics that I want to read, so I put all the things I like into them. So, you know, you kind of just look for those things every time you read a story when you're a creator. Okay. And again, all erase. I'm gonna, you know, erase the first thing I inked from that panel, because I want the other ink, you know, at the bottom of the panel that I just finished drawing to dry, because that's another thing you gotta wait for, is ink drying. You don't want to erase something right after drawing it and then you make a big smear on your artwork, and you're like, you could be extra disappointed after making a drawing that you really like and you're super proud of it. You're like, oh, I got that likeness so well. And then you go straight to erasing, and then you put your hand up, and then you notice that you smeared their face, and now their nose looks funny or something. You're like, ah. So, yeah, I like to wait for the ink to dry a little bit, and then I will erase the things. down. On to the third one. I'm going to be quiet again just to fill out this text so I don't write anything funny. All right. So for this panel, I'm actually going to leave a little space where that hand is. And that's because I'm going to draw a little bit over it so the hand will, you know, be above the text just a little bit. Okay, and then you know, start inking the panel again. Okay, start erasing. And, you know, you can wait to erase until the very end if you want, but I like to erase as I go, just to make the page look less messier and, you know, helps my brain figure out what I've already accomplished. And sometimes when you pencil things over and over and over again, it can just like start to look blurry, or, you know, you kind of can't decipher between the first line you made and the last line you made. So it's good to just like keep erasing things so, you know, a clear vision of what your artwork will look like. Another thing, you know, you'll probably notice is that my panels, I'm drawing the lines for them a lot thicker than my artwork. And some artists, you know, use a really thin line for their panels. And I think that's just a preference thing. There's not really a right way or a wrong way to do that. It's kind of more just like, what do you like? And the really nice thing about making comics is that, you know, you could be a one-person company. Like, really, like, you don't need a huge budget to make a comic. You just need the time and energy to produce the work. You don't need $1 million or $10 million, you know, to film a explosion, and you only can do it in one take, and you have to fill out a permit for it, and you have to wait. And, like, you know, movies, they film stuff out of place, And with comics, you can really just, start from the beginning and just go from there. And I mean, you could also start in the middle and do the end and then do the beginning if you want. But yeah, the nice thing about comics is that it's really your artistic vision, your sole art, like you as the artist or art author or both, or maybe you're collaborating with someone. It's like two people's vision created one thing, and it can be this crazy project, and all it took was your time and effort and energy, which is a lot, but it feels very rewarding. Like, I love making comics. I can't imagine myself doing anything else. When I draw things, I always draw things and think of things sequentially. I find it really hard to make a singular illustration, or like a single panel comic is probably some of the hardest comics I've ever written or drawn. And I've finished a whole graphic novel, but to me that just like feels easier because you can stretch out the story into as many pages as you want. But with a one-page comic or a one-panel comic, you have to encompass everything you want your story to portray into that one page, and that can be really difficult sometimes. Okay, so now that I've finished the text for the final panel, I'll fill out the box. And you can see I'm not doing one solid pull. I'm kind of just doing the line as comfortably as I possibly can, little by little until it's done. Doesn't really bother me that the line is too crooked. I like the authenticity and how genuine that is. How it kind of just looks, more handcrafted. It's like one of my favorite things about comics is, you can really tell the craft that gets put into them. I guess it's, kind of like the same way that, like, a lot of artists, a lot of painters, their favorite paintings are the ones that are, like, the most gestural and have a lot of layers to them, and they can, like, dissect how that other person created it, and it's, like, just really fascinating, when you're a maker and you read a book and you can really decipher how they created it. But it's also really interesting too when you get handed something and you're like, I have no clue how they made this. This is so crazy. Like, this is so unique and original. And then you learn some crazy thing about them, like, oh, they do things digitally, but they do it in a traditional sense where they don't use the rewind button, you know. So everything looks like it was done once, and it's because, well, it was only done once, but it was done digitally. So yeah, lots of cool things to do as an artist, and, you know, pulling tricks. So this is my comic with the panels and text fully inked. Feeling pretty good about it now. I'm just gonna have a sip of water, and then we will begin the actual comic panel inking. Always important to stay hydrated when making comics. Okay, so I'm just gonna start at the beginning again, because I like just working top to bottom. Again, because I like to not have things smear, and if I'm working up here after working on here, you know, sometimes your arm can smear things if it's not completely done drying. It's a bummer. So I'm just trying to avoid all the bummers and mistakes you can make while drawing comics, because, you know, there's actually quite a bit. And I really like to, you know, be happy with my line work, and when I finish something, you know, I want to be able to be like, I really love this, and I can't wait to show my friends and family. Especially, you know, when you're making a comic about your heritage. Because, you know, like, this comic, I'm drawing my grandma, I'm drawing my brother's hand, and I'm also drawing my dad's obsidian collection, just from last summer. He's got a huge collection, actually, but this is just from, like, that one summer trip. So, you know, I'm gonna show it to at least 3 different people, but, you know, definitely I'm showing the whole world. I'm drawing this comic for this video, you know, it's showing my whole process. But yeah, you know, when this is done, I want to be happy with it, so I can show my grandma I drew her to at least some likeness, and you know, show my friend Thema, because they helped me with finding the Teltan word for obsidian. And I also I work for the Teltan language app, so I would like to show my boss to you, because they find it very cool when any of us incorporate Teltan into our art practice, because on the Teltan language team, like half of us are all artists. And if you know, the viewer, if you're taking on this assignment and drawing with me and not just watching it, I fully encourage you to draw a comic with any language that you know that's not English, or to make it bilingual, like my work. You know, any non-English speakers, I really encourage you to make your own comics in your own language, because it's really, there's not a lot of comics with a ton of, you know, indigenous languages in them, especially northern languages, or any language really. Like, it's really important to create this work, to introduce these words and ways to the next generation, you know. Like, I know, you know, a lot of families still speak their traditional language at home to, you know, keep those traditions alive, and it really is important to do that, so you can you know, hold those traditions close and feel, you know, a cultural connection to who you are and your identity. And now this comic, you know, is black and white, and I don't normally work in color. If I do work in color, it's very it's either like monochromatic, or it's like just like a single spot color. But you saw when I showed you my reference photo that Mounted Zaitza is red, and there's a ton of crazy textures and detail into the mountain. So what I like to do is I like to bitmap a lot of textures on Photoshop, and I make them to the right shape and size I want. You know, like, you can make on Photoshop, you can make the zipatone dots really big and spread apart, or really small and really close together to make different hues and grays and shapes and stuff. And what I'll probably do for this panel is I'll bitmap that reference photo, and then I'll paste it on top, and then I'll kind of like fool around with the hue and like the black and white levels, and I'll make it, you know, as dark and light as I want. And yeah, then I'll have my finished panel. Also very important to keep your eraser shavings off the page. So there's my first panel, Mounted Zaitza. So now I'm gonna look at my reference photo again of my grandma, looking at that giant chunk of obsidian. And yeah, again, like, I was just, to get these reference photos, I did a little bit of research. You know, I just went on my mom's Facebook and looked at her photos and at her uploads. That's all I did. And you know, I found this photo. I also, you know, I kind of knew where they would be. So if you're doing a bigger project and you're collaborating with like a lot of people and other family members, and you know, you're relying on other people, it's sometimes it's not so easy, and you have to, you know, go through family photos, or you have to go through messaging family members in another town, and you have to wait for them to respond and, you know, search for whatever you're looking for, but, you know, it's all worth it. Makes a really beautiful comic, and it makes, you know, your project extra special when you're done because you've put in all this effort. And then, you know, when you're done, you get to go back and share it with the family member that helped you, and feels extra special because you're writing about your family, and, you know, you got your family to help you, and yeah. And then there's the chunk of obsidian. We'll use a smaller pen for finer details like the grass. You know, when you draw with multiple pen thicknesses, it can really help with the depth of your story. You know, and like, you can see here that, like, the closer you are, the more detail I'm adding to objects and rocks and things. And then the further it gets, the kind of just becomes lines. And they become more further apart. You know, I add the detail like my grandma. She also has curly hair. So I'll, you know, scribble out her hair. Gotta make it look nice and perfect and permed. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. You know, when I'm done, I want to show this to my grandma, so I want her to be happy with how I drew her. Yeah. So now I'll erase again. Oh, see, I made that mistake, the exact mistake I warned you guys about. I made a smear from erasing. The teacher didn't listen to himself. But you know what? That's okay, because I was gonna fill that out in black anyway, and I can add more grass to that part to kind of make it look more flawless. Or, you know, if you don't mind waiting until the very end, you can edit that, you know, when you've scanned it and you're working on Photoshop or whatever drawing app you like to use. My grandma's shoes are also black. All right. Yeah, that doesn't look too bad. Okay. So now that I've finished the second panel, gonna go on to the third one. Gonna look at my photo reference again. I'm just gonna go ahead. Gonna do this outline with the 8, and then that way the finger lines are, outlined to be as thick as possible. All right. So now that I've done the hand, I'll just finish that speech box. There. And then I'll draw the chunk of obsidian. And yeah. So there's my hand. And now that I've drawn the hand, go back to using the 1. Do my little details. Add my grass. All right. Looks pretty good, Main focus is on the hand, so with the thin outlines, makes the hand look really in focus. I'll wait a second to let it dry so I don't make the same mistake again, because there's no solid blacks in that panel to cover up any smears. We're almost done. Got one more panel to do. Feeling pretty good. You want these comics to, you want to tell a story about your family, and you want it to show them in the most correct way possible. I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job, It's like I'm showing an example of, this is where our ancestors got the obsidian. This is my grandmother searching for it now. This is my brother with it in his hands. And then this is, this is it at home now. This is kind of like where obsidian lives today. And the really cool thing about going to my fish camp every summer is that, there's always obsidian every summer, new obsidian to be found. And that's because, Telegraph is pretty northern BC, and in the winter it snows there quite a bit, and it gets quite cold, just like the Yukon. And when thaw comes in the spring, the land will move around a bit from getting wet and drying and stuff, and it'll push and pull these pieces of obsidian up from the ground into, the surface. And in my family, when you find a piece of obsidian, it's like a really big deal. It's like the ancestors gifted you with something. Like if you find an arrowhead at fish camp, oh man, you were so good that year. Like you really deserved it. Like it's a very special thing. So the fact that my dad found 4 in one summer, man, he must be spoiled rotten, right? He must have been a really good kid. So yeah, I'm gonna continue working on this final panel. Again, working with the 8, gonna do the outlines for these, and then with the 1, I'm gonna do the finer details. You know, and like these examples I said, like you can find them along the fishnet trail, near the creeks, on top of cliffs, and near the smokehouse. Those are all true. My family, we have all found chunks of obsidian in those spots. One of the most common places for my family to find obsidian actually is on the road. Like we have the dirt entrance to fish camp, with all the vehicles that drive on top of it, and they vibrate the ground and shake it up a little bit, and like the tires dig up into the dirt. They will dig up a chunk of obsidian. Every summer we find chunks of obsidian in the driveway entrance, and it's really cool because one of the easy things to like notice obsidian on the surface is just because it's like so shiny. So in the sunlight it really glistens. So if you're really far away and you look at the ground from an angle, you can see all the shiny little chunks that stick out. And sometimes it's like only like a corner will be showing, like a little tip, and then you dig up a little bit and a little bit shows more, you dig up again, and then you pull it out and it's like a whole arrowhead, and it's like you're literally finding artifacts from your family's my family's heritage. So it's a pretty special thing. And I should say, these 2 things in the corner, they're not obsidian. This is a Dandelica bead, I think that's what it's called. And this bead was actually used as like money. It was like you would trade those. You'd trade beads for like medicine or whatever you wanted, And then this bottle my dad found, and he found this really old like fire pit, and it was like we were told there was an old like a muling trail, and like donkeys would go along there and like deliver stuff, and my dad found a bunch of medicine bottles there, and their medicine bottles are like super old, like they're like over 100 years old, and they were for like really old medicine. It was really crazy. There's even a skull and crossbones on one of them. Pretty cool. The other cool thing about obsidian and finding them at fish camp is like you bring them home, you get to share them with people, and you get to tell them their stories about where you found it. Like my dad really did find he did find a whole arrowhead outside the old smoke house. at 9 Mile, and oh man, when my dad found that, my whole family like flipped out, because that's like a direct artifact to our family, you know? Like, it's so mind-boggling to be able to just search for something like that and like actually find it, you know? It's so cool. It's like connecting with the land, connecting with our ancestors. It's really really powerful, you know, to be on the land that my ancestors lived, worked on, and then you find pieces of them, you know, evidence that they were there. They were working on that land that you're sitting on, you know. It's like a lot of people, you know, they're just not informed enough about Indigenous culture, and they don't know anything about it, and they think that like we're a wiped out culture, but that's like, you know, not the truth at all. You know, there's still people that live in Telegraph. There's still people that practice their culture every day there. There's still people that practice the language. There's all these things that, you know, I think a lot of people don't know of and aren't aware of, just frankly because the information's not out, not just because, you know, they're rude and ignoring these things. It's just that they're not well known. And, you know, and that's a reason to make one of these comics, is because, you know, I'm sharing my family's heritage. I'm sharing my family's stories with the world. I'm showing what, you know, a contemporary Indigenous family looks like making these comics, and what a contemporary Indigenous person looks like making these comics. I'm putting a voice to, you know, something that has not been spoken about a lot, or at least not spoken about outside of the culture that it's in. You know, like a lot of, when I go home, it's like normal to me to speak about these things and talk about our family and our culture and stuff. But, you know, I bring it up to someone who's not a part of my world, and they're like totally astonished by it because they have no clue. They had no clue about these things, you know? So making these comics, making, you know, your own comic about your heritage and about your culture and about your people and your ethnicity really shines a light to who you are and what you want to share with the world, you know? Like, it's there's a lot of things that just like haven't ever been talked about or even been considered to talk about in a comic book. And making this comic with me, your version of your own heritage comic, you could be the first person to make, you know, work with your family's history in it, or like your nation's history. Like now I'm gonna say, like, I'm gonna recommend some artists and comics for you. Like, there's Gord Hill, who did one of Van Caff's posters last year, and he's Gord Hill has done 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. He's also done the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book, and he's also done the Antifa comic book. And all his comics are historically factual, and it's all 100% real information, and it's really impressive to read his stories and how much knowledge you learn from them. It's just, yeah, it's really crazy to read his work and, you know, learn something new. Like his a lot of his comics are about activism and grassroots culture and Indigenous culture. Another artist that I really look up to is Michael Yagalanis, who's done Red Haidamanga, and he's also done Carp's Fan. That's his latest book. He's also done War of the Blink, Old Growth, which the Grunt Gallery published, and I love that book, Old Growth. It's like a collection of his comics from like the 70s to like 2010. So it's like 40 years worth of comics, and a bunch of them are like comics that were like printed in like the Haida like community newspaper. So like comics that were printed like 40 years ago that only like, you know, one community saw and were never shown again. And then they're like reproduced in this book, and they're about like like oil rigs in Haida Gwaii, and like anti forestry and stuff like that. Like, it's really impressive to read those comics and see how those issues he drew about like 40 or 50 years ago at this point are still relevant today. Like, it's kind of crazy to read that comic and be like, wow, there's still tankers on the BC coast, you know, killing marine life and spilling oil and stuff. It's really, really tragic. But it's, you know, it's really important to read these things and understand your history and where these artists are coming from. Yeah, there's also High Water Press, and they publish Indigenous comics and write a lot of Indigenous stories, and a lot of them are in Cree, which is really cool. Yeah, so this is my finished inked comic, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed hearing all my ramblings and my process on how I created this. And yeah, let's take a look again on the computer. I hope you enjoyed watching me draw and seeing my thought process on Hertiage comics. But before we go, I just thought it would be cool to share with what my comic looks like on the screen, finally, you know, scanned and finished. So here it is. Dewdot, Obsidian, by Cole Pauls. When we visit 9 Mile, my family's fish camp, we look for obsidian. My ancestors used it to create tools, and you can still find pieces of obsidian around camp. You can find them along the fishnet trail, near creeks, on top of cliffs, near the smokehouse, wherever my ancestors roamed. So there you go. There's my Hertiage comic, and I can't wait to see what all you guys have created. And VanCaf and I are asking you to submit your Hertiage comics in this exact same format. So if you drew along with me and you made a comic and you feel comfortable enough to share it with the world and us, you can email it to info@vancaf.com, and we'll include it on the VanCaf website. And for everyone who submits a comic, I will personally reply a nice written note about your story. And yeah, thanks a lot for watching this whole video and participating in the online version of VanCaf. I'd like to thank Izzy and Robin for this opportunity. I always love teaching comics and sharing my story with you guys, and you know, just establishing about how important it is to have your own voice, and how easy it is to have your own voice making comics. So yeah, I think that's it. Thanks a lot for joining me, and I will see you guys sometime in the future. Bye-bye.